Hello, my name is Kelsey Raymer. I'm a junior scholar, and welcome back to the McConnell Center series, Why You Should Read. Today we welcome Lieutenant Colonel Trivius Caldwell to discuss why we should read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Lieutenant Caldwell is an active duty Army infantry officer for nearly 20 years. He earned his bachelor's degree of arts in English from Tuskegee University and holds a Master of Arts degree from Auburn University and the Command and General Staff College, respectively. He's currently pursuing a PhD in English at Duke University. Previously, he served as an assistant professor of English at the United States Military Academy at West Point. His most recent book, Turium Quid, is a collection of poetry detailing reflections from his military war experience. His research interests include 20th century African American literature, sound studies, and hip-hop literature. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Caldwell to the McConnell Center to discuss Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man.
All right, thank you. Okay, hey, so good to see everybody back here again eating the pie, because there's a lot of it, so indulge in that. Hey, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to jump right in here and start talking about Invisible Man. This is a novel that I've been focused on for nearly 25 years. I learn something new each time I read it, which is to say something about how prophetic the text is. And I hope you got that too from reading it. I do want to briefly acknowledge some scholars up front that has helped me over the years to develop my understanding of this text. Dr. Barbara Baker and Dr. Caroline Gebhardt from Tuskegee were my two instructors my undergraduate year in the year 2000 who introduced me to Ralph Ellison. Dr. Paul Devlin, he's at the Merchant Marine Academy. He's an Ellison scholar. And Dr. Herman Beavers is at UPenn, and they've both been instrumental in helping me through my dissertation. I have a chapter on Ralph Ellison, so they've been instrumental in that. They both focus on sound in the novel. Nicole Furlong, she has a book called Race Sounds. She focused specifically on listening with respect to Invisible Man, so that's been a huge help. And then I'm indebted to Dr. Gregg as well, who enabled me to visit the Ralph Ellison papers at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. I also want to shout out Colleen Owls. Dr. Owls is at West Point. She's been a great intellectual mentor for me. And then last but not least, my alma mater, Tuskegee, which really introduced me to the setting that Ellison presumably talks about in Invisible Man, and he also was a student there. I also want to thank collectively the McConnell Center. For the last decade, I have participated in the professional intellectual journey myself through the Strategic Broadening Seminar. As many of you know, every year a cohort of American soldiers descend upon this place to study those philosophical questions, those practical questions guiding our democracy and her defense. And I think for me, on the periphery of that effort is a love of literature and the many ways I get to see how protagonists like Ellison's worked in the same concerns that old philosophers and our nation's founders also experienced. And so I suppose that's why I'm here today, because Ralph Ellison's novel Invisible Man is in many ways, it mirrors my own intellectual curiosity. In other words, my adventure to try and figure out what he claims as the special role American fiction plays in the development of the nation has been an exciting professional endeavor. I want to make the disclaimer up front that this is really complicated stuff. It has taken me 25 years to try to understand this novel, right? So I'm going to presume that you haven't read the entire book, and I'm going to try not to spoil it as I go along. I suppose what I'm trying to do here today is to convince you that spending time with Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is a worthwhile adventure. Now, I use the term adventure deliberately here because it signals a kind of exploration of the unknown, and any good work of literature should and will have this effect. But Ellison's work exemplifies this for a variety of reasons that I hope to articulate specifically today. As an American citizen and soldier, one of my personal task is to continuously scrutinize America and her ideas, to identify those dark areas and the folds of the fabric of our collective unity. This, I believe, is where progress starts, in the dark and disputed and often unseen corners of our collective dwelling. And so Invisible Man is a kind of blueprint for my curiosity. And so here's the question I've been asked here to address, which is, why should we read Invisible Man? What's the point of the novel? And there's a simple but complicated answer. As American citizens, it is incumbent upon us to continually define our collective American experience. And if we think about it, it's a complicated phenomenon, this democratic experiment otherwise a collision of social, cultural, political, religious, racial, and ethnic factors, not to mention those values of prosperity, liberty, and freedom that we espouse, yet we struggle to agree on its implementation. So what Ralph Ellison sets out to do in Invisible Man was not only to explore the complexity of Black life in America, but also pierce American diversity as a deeply layered arrangement intertwining other voices that are often left unheard. Ellison doesn't just dissect the Black experience, he probes the American soul, revealing how personal and collective identities are molded by history's shadows and unspoken tensions. Through a coming-of-age story, Invisible Man forces us to question our assumptions about visibility, agency, and belonging in a country still grappling with fulfilling its promises. In short, we should read this novel because it is our responsibility to. I use this term responsibility to invoke our ability to take charge of shaping our own identities. So a little bit about Ralph Waldo Ellison. Ralph Ellison is born in 1914 in Oklahoma City to Lewis and Ida Ellison. Ralph takes his name from his father's literary hero, Ralph Waldo Emerson. In fact, Ellison's father wanted him to be a poet himself. After his father's death, I think he's about 2 years old when his father dies, Ellison and his two siblings and his mother would endure Jim Crow up until the Tulsa race riots in 1921, after which they moved to Gary, Indiana with Ellison's uncle. In 1933, Ellison hops a freight train to Tuskegee Institute to play the trumpet under the famed composer William Dawson. Music was important to Ellison. He studied music in his high school, Frederick Douglass High School, and he would use the trumpet, wanted to play the trumpet at Tuskegee as a way to pay for school. I should also mention that while he's at Tuskegee, he gets a job in the library, and outside of class, he's studying in the library. This is where he meets T.S. Eliot, Herman Melville, and others. After only 3 years at Tuskegee, however, Ellison ran out of money. He moves to New York, studying sculpture and taking other jobs to earn funds. Now, while he's in New York, he stays at a YMCA, and this is where he meets the poet Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes introduces him to the novelist Richard Wright. And then the rest is pretty much history, right? Now, this is around 1936. The Harlem Renaissance is in full bloom, and Ellison is a kind of cultural apprentice on the periphery of this cultural awakening. It is in Harlem that Ellison locates the fusion between music and literature, leveraging Hughes and Wright as writing mentors. And toward the end of World War II, Ellison enlists in the United States Merchant Marines. He serves as a cook there. And in his spare time, he continued to master his craft of writing, trying, as he admits, to render the complexity of African American life in as much clarity as his literary hero, T.S. Eliot, who we know wrote The Wasteland. In 1952, the first novel of this talk, Invisible Man, that was published. It won the National Book Award in 1953 for fiction, and this carried him throughout a lecture circuit throughout Europe and into a teaching position at Bard College in New York. Now, in 1975, Ellison was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and as a literary critic, he wrote a substantial amount of essays, drafted over 2,000 pages of manuscripts over a 40-year period, leaving a treasure trove of material housed at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Ellison died from pancreatic cancer in his home in New York on April 16, 1994. As mentioned, Invisible Man is an American novel that functions as a kind of mirror, a mirror reflecting back to us our most primitive and primal and ever-present aspects of our character, those we tend to suppress yet we manifest nonetheless. And so this novel in many ways is a work about what lie in those crevices that I mentioned earlier. The novel follows an unnamed and adolescent protagonist from Oklahoma through the Deep South, presumably Tuskegee, and into the bowels of Harlem, New York. Ellison insists that his novel is not autobiographical, but there is some crossover given his triangulated journey, his own journey from Oklahoma through Tuskegee to Harlem. I've always referred to Ellison's unnamed narrator as invisible as a name because the predominant themes of the novel describes this perspective. He is unnamed throughout the novel. Most scholars call him invisible, or the unnamed narrator is how they refer to him. Most scholars also assert that Invisible's adventure is moot because throughout the novel, he searches for that which he already has, which is agency. Only his understanding of what it means to be effective exists in the recognition from the people he attempts to lead throughout the episodes of the book. This novel is perhaps its own philosophical question because in it, we as readers are likely to confront our own need for recognition. So the complicated idea surrounding this novel, and one that is surely worth your time, is the notion that to be invisible, one must confront the factors causing such a disposition. We must acknowledge those factors as sustaining forces in the assertion of power and ask how they might also contribute to preventing our erasure. Invisible Man compels us to examine how societal structures and ideologies shape our identities, imposing limits on our visibility and influence. The novel suggests that true agency is not merely about being seen, but rather understanding the dynamics of recognition and claiming autonomy as a driving force in leadership. To that end, the novel challenges us to ask, can one ever be fully visible in a world that defines itself through exclusion? Or does empowerment come from an acceptance of invisibility as a self-determined existence? Now, these are really big questions, but those that we all probably confront on a daily basis. So let's back up a bit, okay? Because to understand invisible is to understand his character as a proxy, kind of proxy of ourselves. We got to understand why he was created, okay? In 1969, Ralph Ellison travels to the United States Military Academy at West Point, and there he lectures on, or his lecture is entitled, On Initiation, Rights, and Power. Ellison said this about his novel, Invisible Man, quote, "One afternoon, I wrote some words while sitting in an old barn looking out on the mountain." This is in Vermont. And these words were, quote, "I am an invisible man." I didn't quite know what that meant. I didn't know where that idea came from. I thought, well, maybe I should try to discover exactly what it was that lied behind that statement. Now, at the time of this writing, Ellison's on sick leave from the Merchant Marines. He'd taken a writing trip to Vermont, and while he's there, he's grappling with his World War II experiences. In fact, the novel was conceived out of a war story wherein Ellison's protagonist was far from invisible. Initially, this character was an Army Air Corps pilot who was shot down behind enemy lines. This pilot was taken to a Nazi prisoner of war camp where his identity became the very subject of his bondage. The pilot was the highest ranking prisoner there, and he was black. Now, I'll save you the complexity of the social dynamics at stake at a place like that, a Nazi POW camp in Germany. But I'll tell you that Ellison's tendency to grapple with pluralism really starts here. Now, pluralism is a philosophy that emphasizes the coexistence and mutual respect of diverse groups, ideas, and cultures within a shared political or social system. Right? Ellison went on to explain to cadets, quote, "I felt that there was a great deal about the nature of American experience which was not understood by most Americans. I felt also that the diversity of the total experience rendered much of it mysterious. And I felt that because so much of it was, which appeared unrelated, was actually most intimately intertwined, it needed exploring. In fact," he continued, "I believe that unless we continually explore the network of complex relationships which bind us together, we would continue being the victims of various inadequate conceptions of ourselves, both as individuals and as citizens of a nation of diverse peoples," end quote. So Ellison focuses on American diversity. It extends beyond racial and geographical or religious factors. He's thinking about the complex entanglement of all of these categories and how they land on American citizens. The product of that knot, that socio-cultural knot, that web of factors is manifested in his protagonist, Invisible. The irony here is that invisibility signifies those factors that we cannot see or easily perceive. Invisible people bear a certain weight of societal assumption and stereotypes. They are unseen and burdened by the expectations and prejudices of others. Actually, as Ellison alludes to, we see them everywhere. And so I want to return back to that question, why should we read Invisible Man? I offer 3 practical reasons. First, it is a novel inviting readers to confront the unseen forces shaping their identities and belonging in America. Second, the novel offers profound commentary on the personal cost of invisibility and the struggle for recognition. The Invisible Man is much like all of us in that we rely heavily on the opinions of others to guide our self-worth. And third, Ellison's writing is an exploration on what it means to find one's voice amid a society that amplifies and simultaneously silences it. He's doing some heavy lifting for us in this novel. Ellison also integrates musical tropes like the blues and jazz to both offer a rich glimpse into African-American vernacular tradition, but also to elaborate on Invisible's effort to reconcile his consciousness with the world around him. This is a kind of improvisation that we all benefit from. Given nearly 250 years of practicing democracy, All of these points have always applied in this country. And to be transparent, given Ellison's publication in 1952, it exists in a kind of mid-century post-war and pre-civil rights fog, right? This is also, I should note, during the Korean War. McCarthyism is at play during this time. This is also the era of the American dream ideology, the white picket fence, the nuclear family. That's all happening just before the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And like his mentor T.S. Eliot, Ellison renders his contemporary wasteland in his view of a divided American landscape post-World War II, okay? So Ellison is extremely deliberate about rendering the black experience in America as one of a persistent search for belonging. This novel, Invisible Man, is his reflection. It allows us to think about the role we play in that tangled web of politics, social history, and cultural belonging, especially given our shared experiences as Americans. So personally, this book has allowed me to capture moments of my own intellectual formation. That is to say that not only does Ellison and I share Tuskegee as an alma mater, but also his namesake, Ralph Waldo Emerson, also influenced me throughout his writing in my undergraduate years. Self-Reliance is a great essay. You should check that out. It's mentioned in Invisible Man. It's ever so subtly. You'll miss it if you don't know. But Ellison is a man of letters. He's influenced by other literary mentors, among them T.S. Eliot, Dostoevsky, Herman Melville, William Faulkner, Richard Wright, and Langston Hughes. And all of these writers in some way complicate what it means to be American, which is to say something about those unseen forces continuously shaping our identity and belonging. And just as an aside, I should tell you that most literature is a dialogic exchange, which means that Ellison is responding to T.S. Eliot. He is responding to Herman Melville and others. This goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, Socrates, the things that you all read that have questions about. So, when you read literature, you read Invisible Man, if you can take the perspective that he is in dialogue with these authors, trying to practice and really perfect his craft of writing, then it becomes a little bit more approachable, right? Invisible Man does not just stand alone. It's in response to a long tradition of literature. And it also speaks to the nation's character and the things that are going on in the 50s at the time of the publication. So at the beginning of the novel, we find Invisible in an underground basement. He gives us this disposition at the outset, and from the text, quote, this is on the first page, "I'm an invisible man. That invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition in the eyes with those whom I come in contact. A matter of the construction of their inner eyes, those eyes with which they look upon through their physical eyes upon reality. It is sometimes advantageous to be unseen, although it is most often wearing on the nerves. You wonder whether you aren't simply a phantom in other people's minds. It's when you feel like this that out of resentment you begin to bump people back. You ache with the need to convince yourself that you do exist in the real world, that you're a part of all the sound and anguish. And you strike out with your fists, you curse and you swear to make them recognize you. But that is getting too far ahead of the story, almost to the end, although the end is in the beginning and lies far ahead." So, just as an aside, Ellison is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this first passage, right? He's disrupting sound, he's disrupting time, he's introducing sound as a motif, as a theme as well, and he's telling you something about the protagonist from a state of invisibility, not physical, but a social type of invisibility, okay? Now, during an interview about Ellison, the late writer Toni Morrison remarks that he's writing for a white audience. He took a lot of criticism for his pluralistic stance. And her reply to his statement, "I am an invisible man," was in the form of a profound question. And she says, well, invisible to whom? Which is a really deep question to ponder. And this is perhaps the critical point tying together those three reasons to read the novel. It is the persistent need to prove oneself to another entity. Now, this is the whole old Hegelian idea of the master-slave dialectic, wherein the subjugated must acknowledge inferiority as a condition that sustains power hierarchies. We're going to get into that a little bit later. But that's really important. Hegel, it's back there on the shelf there. You should check it out. Out of this dynamic questions about what it means to be are asked. And this is the ontological aspect of the question as well, what it means to be in the world where you exist on a dialectical plane, okay? Returning to the text, at the outset, Ellison's Invisible Man is almost ushered from an initial setting in Greenwood. I think Greenwood, Oklahoma, doesn't specifically say. but I'm coupling Ellison's autobiographical experience with the narrator. So he goes from Greenville to and through the Deep South, presumably Tuskegee. He doesn't say Tuskegee, but I can tell you the descriptions in that novel mirror and match that university. I know because I spent a significant amount of time there. Okay. In the novel, Invisible escorts a rich trustee to the outskirts of town. And he's not supposed to be doing this. He's meeting sharecroppers and Army veterans in a bar called the Golden Day. And he ends up getting dismissed from the college, and he travels by train to the streets of Harlem, an epicenter of black culture. This sounds a lot like Ellison's own experience. And throughout this adventure, Invisible finds himself struggling with multiple aspects of black identity. All right, and this goes back a long way too. There's two aspects of this. There's that Southern folk tradition expressed through rhythm and music and dialect. This is the stuff soul food is made out of, right, if you're familiar with that. And there's a great scene in chapter 13 about the significance of the yam, which has a rich history that we're going to get into. It's a rich, starchy root that really symbolizes the black diaspora as a kind of remembrance. Kendrick Lamar has commented on the yam and Kunta Kinte on his 2015 album, To Pimp a Butterfly. So like the yam has significance, and Ellison understands this. So that's the southern portion. But then there's a northern aspect to this too, which is a more intellectual, perhaps political expression through art, through oratory, through literature. It's a presumed northern enlightenment that ties itself up with the Harlem Renaissance as a political act. Here you see the schism of W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington manifest itself, right? And this is the product of the Great Migration as a social cultural transformation for black folks in particular, right? So you have a schism that exists from northern and southern intellectual perceivings, right? And Ellison is dealing with this through Invisible. So in the North, Invisible comes in contact with a quasi-communist group called the Brotherhood. And this arrangement demonstrates Ellison's critique of the merger of political ideology and white liberalism. We mentioned McCarthyism at play. And so he really implies that in this Brotherhood contact that he creates through Invisible. But then also there's this exhibition of unseen forces waiting to challenge and amplify Invisible's consciousness. Now, to the first point about those unseen forces shaping identity, Ellison reminds us that the mythologies that we enroll ourselves in through our memory hunts us, right, as we attempt to move forward. There's a great scene in the beginning with his grandfather, right, dreaming, and he tells Invisible to keep grinning, and that looms throughout the novel until the epilogue, okay? It is not so natural for us to observe ourselves as we grow in real time, and Ellison's novel attempts to explore this development through episodic reminders of Invisible's struggle to gain agency through the acceptance of others. In fact, in reading this novel, we get to witness invisibility in real time. To the second point about the personal cost of invisibility and the struggle for recognition, Ellison offers a grim reply. At the end of the novel, after many episodes of attempting to prove himself, Ellison admits, "I am an invisible man, and it placed me in a hole, or showed me the hole I was in, if you will, and I reluctantly accepted the fact. I do not know whether accepting the lesson had placed me in the rear or in the avant-garde." He closes the novel with the following often critiqued questions, quote, "Being invisible and without substance, a disembodied voice, as it were, what else could I do? What else but try to tell you what was really happening where your eyes were looking through? And it is this which frightens me. Who knows but that on the lower frequencies I speak for you," end quote. Now, those lower frequencies have occupied my graduate studies for several years now. At this moment, I'm attempting to discern those lower frequencies as I write a dissertation concerning the third point about Ellison's use of musical tropes. In fact, the novel situates Louis Armstrong early as a proxy of invisibility. In other words, Armstrong's song, "What Did I Do to Be Black and Blue?" seemingly captures the spirit of the novel. It's very melancholic. The lower frequency Ellison writes about has to do with a kind of felt sense. It's that feeling of nostalgia you get when you listen to music. Generally speaking, music triggers memory, right? And that's why you like favorite songs. They give you a vibrational feel. You get goosebumps. It's not really the music that's doing that. It's the memory associated with it, right? So memory tends to reappear in what I call soundscapes. Some great scholarship on this, and those images can be navigated through certain realities. They also create that mythology and propels it in the future, right? So you can create futures out of those memories triggered by the music, if you understand how that works. And we talked about the Kendrick Lamar piece, like he raps, the yam is the power that be, which is double entendre we'll talk about later. But this is a nod to Ralph Ellison. Communicating on lower frequencies also, in this case, doesn't refer to literal sound frequencies. It suggests an entanglement on a deeper and more profound level. In other words, lower frequencies may be more felt than heard, requiring an examination of more fundamental aspects of human experiences or emotion that might not be readily articulated or apparent. And so Ellison uses improvisation, he uses call and response, he uses dissonance to invoke jazz music and the blues as a soundtrack of a period in which he writes. Now, one of the prevailing themes that consistently appear in the novel is Ellison's critique about time. Take, for example, the structuring of the novel itself. Ellison's prologue is told from a perspective in hindsight. The Invisible Man is situated in an underground basement somewhere on the periphery of Harlem. And before giving us his memoir, he warns readers that, quote, the end is the beginning. This is Ellison's riddle, a constant interrogation of identity construction. And he addresses the extraneous forces working against us, considering, the former cliche, time is not on our side. And so my second read of Invisible Man, I actually read it backwards. Like I started with the epilogue, and then I went into the prologue and read forward. And it gives you a different, it kind of warps and disrupts time in a way. A really interesting approach. I'm trying really hard not to read too much into the scenes so I don't spoil the novel for you, but I find it interesting that the protagonist is always reflecting back on his journey. We do get the novel's perspective in hindsight, so we have to figure out if we trust the Invisible Man as he's telling us this as well. So that is also at play. One way Invisible uses, going back to the musical tropes, is that improvisation of Invisible's journey. This is Ellison's use of improvisation. Now, improvisation implies spontaneity, adaptability, and creativity. You've probably witnessed that throughout your undergraduate experience. The literary critic Fred Moten calls the product of improvisation surplus lyricism. Okay? Now, this surplus is the new thing, right? The tertium quid, if you will. It can be used by others in their efforts toward the same identity consciousness that Invisible seeks. In another way, when Ellison writes, on the lower frequency, I speak for you, he gives us the ability to exploit the surplus of the novel as a life lesson that we can use, right? But it requires something of us as well, because we have to enter into the dialogue. We got to enter into Invisible's setting, and that requires imagination, and that requires a space of quiet, right, to go into the literature, all right? Now, this might seem complicated, but if you think about how the past informs the present, like we just talked about, that dialogic exchange, and you apply that to the progress of your own intellectual journey, then what you'll find is that Ellison gives us his protagonist as a scapegoat for our own progress. We have a voice in the novel Invisible Man, right? We can judge the narrator, right? We can judge Ellison, so to speak. The novel, the literature belongs to us. I should also note that Ellison begins the novel with the personal pronoun I, and he ends it, the last word is the second personal pronoun you. And not to get too nerdy on grammar up here, but everything in between is a kind of barrier preventing unity between the two forces, which are the reader and the writer. And here is, I think, a good list of the themes that lie in between that I and you. So Ellison's dealing with identity frustration, racism and oppression, power and manipulation, the search for truth and enlightenment. He's dealing with alienation and isolation, social and political ideology, double consciousness, which is a Du Boisian idea. He's dealing with violence and resistance, the dynamic exchange or engagement with systemic racism, and betrayal by mentors and institutions. The novel is brilliant and it takes time to digest, but it's worth your time. It's worth the adventure. It has to do with Ellison's ability to really think out loud, which is a courageous act given the time that he's writing in. I've also always been struck by a passage about human nature from Ralph Emerson. And this is Ellison's namesake. As I mentioned, Emerson had an immense influence on Ellison. And in an 1836 essay entitled Nature, Emerson writes this, quote, undoubtedly, we have no questions to ask which are unanswerable. We must trust the perfection of the creation so far as to believe that whatever curiosity the order of things has awakened in our mind, the order of things can satisfy. Every man's condition is a solution in hieroglyphic to those inquiries he would put. He acts his life before he apprehends it as truth. In like manner, nature is already, in its forms and tendencies, describing its own design. Let us interrogate that great spirit that shines so peacefully around us. Let us inquire to what end is nature." End quote. So human nature begs this interrogation, yet we often find ourselves too busy to search within ourselves for it. Again, time is not on our sides. Throughout Invisible Man's journey, he demonstrates the necessity to interrogate himself in a place of solitude, which is that underground basement, which is also a nod to Dante Alighieri. Okay? His memories are triggered by interactions on the streets, and he is forced to wonder whether he has grown from those experiences or if he is ashamed of them. This is that kind of double consciousness that I talked about, always judging yourself by the standards of someone else, right? If you do that, a portion of your brain is thinking about what's being said about you and not about the thing that you're doing, okay? And perhaps, this is Ellison's own understanding. The subject of Toni Morrison's critique itself is at play in the novel here. And so there's a profound passage in the prologue that addresses this. In the prologue, Invisible slips into a daze while smoking reefer and listening to Louis Armstrong. And this hallucination takes him to a church service wherein the pastor is preaching about blackness. And from the text, quote, "In the beginning there was blackness, and the sun was bloody red. Now black is and black ain't. Black will get you and it won't." End quote. The preacher insinuates interracial strife as a barrier to self-consciousness, and Ellison has the courage to explore this by commenting on colorism, aspect of colorism, as one of those barriers preventing unity. Colorism is the prejudice or discrimination against individuals with a dark skin tone, typically among people of the same ethnic or racial group. There are many other scenes in the novel that demonstrate this, but I want to briefly recount a story of Ellison's experience with this phenomenon. Now, this story is interesting. It kind of shocked me when I heard about it. In 1967, Ralph Ellison, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Judge Henry Wingate are attending this reception. This reception is in Grinnell College in Iowa. During a social hour, a young black man drove 4 hours, and he bum rushed the party. Right? I think he's a Black Panther Party member. He comes into the party, crashes in to confront Ralph Ellison in the middle of this reception. So you can imagine a bunch of people, sitting around, small talk, having drinks. Guy comes in, and the black guy comes in, looks at Ellison, and young man criticizes Ellison for being a sellout. Calls him a sellout, calls him an Uncle Tom, claiming he had not done due diligence concerning his own people, and not in those words. He's doing this in front of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., by the way, which is a crazy scene to think about. So Ellison, in response, because everybody's looking at Ralph Ellison at this point, and Ellison starts crying. In the middle of the reception, starts crying, and he's asserting, "I'm not an Uncle Tom. I am not an Uncle Tom. You don't understand what I'm doing. Go back to throwing Molotov cocktails." That's what he tells the boy. So Ellison's doing something really subtle here, and he's critiqued quite harshly for it. This indictment plagued Ellison. As we know, Invisible Man is the only full novel that he created. He had others, but they were burned in fires. He created a lot of essays, but never another novel. And there's a lot of speculation as to why. He had been obsessed with rendering the African American experience, given all its complexity, in a similar way as had T.S. Eliot. So when you read The Wasteland, you're going to understand the complexity that Ellison's writing under. I'm not Ellison, but Eliot is writing under. And Ellison is trying to mimic that. He had an obsession with writing. And just so you know, if you go to the Ellison papers at the Library of Congress, you're going to find probably 10 or 20 short story chapters that never made the novel, right? But are extensions of the novel. It's really interesting. Ellison had the courage to try to interrogate the possibilities given an American economy of force, unity, and collective progress. For him, the closest metaphor to rendering such a condition was jazz music. And his protagonist, Invisible, would be the chief musician of invisible music. So what we have to understand is that Invisible, like us, is subject to the sociology of his birth. And that examination of human social life in America during the pre-civil rights era, relies upon division according to race and ethnicity, and in some cases, gender. What happens when that happens is the formulation of behavior that becomes nested with identity insofar as it becomes central to who we are and how we see the world. In this way, we all contribute to the sociology with whom we come in contact with. There are two pivotal moments in the novel where Invisible is subject to this process of social conditioning. The first instance occurs by a former veteran, a man he meets during that Golden Day scene earlier in the novel. The other instance takes place in the president's office at the Southern University. Ellison offers both accounts to demonstrate how malleable we can become when seeking approval from the outside world. So the veteran scolds Invisible in front of the white university trustee, Mr. Norton. He says, quote, "You see," and he's talking to Mr. Norton, "you see, Invisible, he has eyes and ears and a good distended African nose, but he fails to understand the simple facts of life. Understand? It's worse than that. He registers with his senses, but he short-circuits his brain. Nothing has meaning. He takes it in, but he doesn't digest it. Already he is, well, bless my soul, behold, a walking zombie. Already he's learned to repress not only his emotions, but his humanity. He's invisible, a walking personification of the negative. The most perfect achievement of your dreams, sir, the mechanical man," end quote. So in this description, Ellison alludes to Invisible's role on that dialectical plane that I talked about. On one pole, there's the dominant. On the other, that's the subjugated. And the negative denotes invisibility, which is a mechanical function in the sense that invisibility is a product of systemic or bureaucratic erasure. In another way, invisibility becomes a tool of resistance, allowing the subjugated to navigate and subvert the systems that seek to erase them. Now take the second example from the university president, Dr. Bledsoe, who is presumably President Moton, Robert Moton, second president of Tuskegee. He rebukes Invisible, and this is, I should say also, this is almost an indictment to Tuskegee, okay, because when Ellison puts Dr. Bledsoe as an archetype of Moton, he's implying that Moton has sold out himself, okay, so this is a huge critique in the Ellisonian world. He rebukes Ellison for allowing the white trustee into the Golden Day Bar. The Golden Day Bar is a place where the vets kind of drink and share stories and whatnot. The president elaborates on Invisible's sociological role as the negative or presumed invisible man. The president says, quote, "You've got to be disciplined, boy. There's no ifs, ands, or ands about it. Boy, you are a fool," he says. "Your white folk didn't teach you anything, and your mother wit has left you cold. What has happened to you young Negroes? I thought you had caught on to how things are down here, but you don't even know the difference between the way things are and the way things are supposed to be," end quote. And he gasps and he concludes with this question: what is the race coming to? All right, so this university president is black, again, presumably Moton. Moton was light-skinned enough that he could pass, right, which is another key theme that Ellison deals with. But he also understands himself as a kind of ventriloquist to white folks. Right, white people at the time, especially benefactors who could pump money into the university. Okay, so from a factual perspective, if you go to Tuskegee, you're going to see Ford Hall, you're going to see Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie Hall, all of these folks who endowed Booker T. Washington with these funds. And in order to do that, you got to do what the grandfather said in the beginning of the novel. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So Ralph Ellison presents several more examples of social conditioning to impress upon his initial goal of interrogating the nuance in the complex intermixing of social and cultural categories. So if we can approach Invisible Man as a series of episodic case studies, examining the different ways and means of how invisibility is both metaphorical and real, then we might be able to exploit that invisibility to deny its function as a means of erasure. And so Ellison does this work for us, okay? So in closing, I just want to emphasize that the personal commitment to this book requires you to really interrogate your own interaction with folks in the world around you. It is more than a leisure read because it requires you to empathize with Invisible along his journey. It requires us to ask certain questions of ourselves, perhaps revealing the ways and means of our own moments of invisibility, hopefully revealing the sociology of our own circumstance. In the end, reading Invisible Man helps to reveal those hidden forces propelling our own adventures, and we can make them intelligible so that we are better able to better equipped to notice them when they threaten our own agency. So I hope you read the novel in its totality. I hope something I shared with you today triggers some thought or a way into Ellison's world. And in his words, Invisible Man is his novel, but it's Invisible's memoir, right? So if you can read it as Invisible's memoir, then you can approach it from that perspective as well. So thank you for your time.